Pearl Harbor stands as one of the most brutal acts of World War II. Yet, beneath the surface of this well-documented event lies a somber and often overlooked narrative: the fate of the dead bodies of Pearl Harbor. Over 2,000 men were bombed, burnt, and drowned to death, despite not yet being at war. Many of these men remained trapped in their watery graves, while many others are still unidentified, nameless bodies, buried in unknown graves. The identification of bodies is still ongoing today, as new technologies allow these unknown men to finally be given back their names. Despite these efforts, hundreds of these bodies remain anonymous, and sons, sisters, brothers, and daughters still hold out hope for giving their relatives a proper burial. These men, trapped in the sinking vessels, will unfortunately remain unidentified and undisturbed forever, as recovery is impossible. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed the course of World War II, forcing America into the war. The attack shocked both America and the world. The United States had previously thought it was safe, thousands of miles from the battlefields of Europe, but another enemy lurked on the horizon. 350 aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service launched a bombing raid on the American naval base in Hawaii, killing thousands of American servicemen and sinking and damaging almost 20 warships. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers lay in wait 200 miles north of Hawaii. At 6 a.m., the words "Tora, Tora, Tora" were broadcast over the Japanese radio waves, signifying the start of the attack. At 7:58 a.m. on the 7th of December 1941, hundreds of Japanese bombers, fighters, and torpedo bombers arrived at Pearl Harbor and commenced their attack. Over the course of 75 minutes, almost 2,500 American servicemen and 63 civilians would be slaughtered, and many vessels of the American Pacific Fleet seriously damaged or destroyed. America was in the process of hostile discussions with Japan over intervention in the Japanese invasion of China and American sanctions on Japan, but was unprepared for any military action, as there had been no declaration of war. The United States was not yet at war, and so was not prepared for an attack. The American servicemen stationed at Pearl Harbor were legally non-combatants and believed they were currently at peace. This meant they were not prepared to recover and treat wounded men, nor were they ready with ample air defenses. Almost half of the casualties came from the destruction of the battleship Arizona after its ammunition magazine detonated. At 8:06, a Japanese bomb struck Turret 2, piercing the deck and igniting over 1 million pounds of explosives, tearing the ship in two. The blast was so strong that it extinguished the fires raging on the Vestal, a repair ship moored alongside it. Perhaps one of the most gruesome incidents of Pearl Harbor happened after the sinking of the USS West Virginia. Struck by a mixture of bombs and torpedoes, the battleship sunk in shallow waters. Most of the crew of 1,241 sailors and 64 officers were successfully evacuated, but 106 would unfortunately be killed in the attack. 3 of these casualties, Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Lewis Costin, were trapped in an airtight storeroom, now underwater, and were unable to escape. In the days following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Marines standing guard heard dull thuds emanating from the wreckage. These thuds and bangs were the cries for help of 3 trapped sailors, still alive, but slowly starving and suffocating. When salvage crews raised the wreckage 6 months later, they made a harrowing discovery: 3 bodies and a calendar scribbled on the wall in red pencil. The men had survived 16 days in the cold and dark, trapped in the carcass of the West Virginia. Recovery. The recovery of the dead immediately after the attack was difficult. Men were torn into pieces and thrown into the sea, or their bodies were entangled amongst the twisted, melted metal of the sunken ships. Japan and America declared war the day following the attack. This unsuspected mobilization of the American armed forces and the rushed preparations for war meant that serious recovery efforts were slow. In the days and weeks that followed, naval divers and private salvage contractors worked to raise the damaged ships, many of which were repaired and returned to service. Divers worked inside the sunken vessels, patching holes, clearing debris, and pumping water. Within 6 months, 5 battleships and 2 cruisers had been repaired and refloated, allowing them to recover many of the dead. Intensive salvage operations continued for another year, totaling over 20,000 underwater working hours. The two dreadnought battleships, the USS Arizona and Utah, were too damaged to be raised, and both remain in the waters of Pearl Harbor to this day, serving as memorials for the fallen. After locating and recovering a small number of the bodies of the Arizona, it was decided that any further efforts were fruitless, and at least 900 deceased sailors remain on board today. The diving equipment of the time was crude, requiring a long tube connected to the diving suit, through which oxygen was pumped from above. This meant that exploring the wrecks was incredibly hazardous and, in some cases, impossible. The attack also resulted in many liters of fuel and oil leaking into the shallow waters of the harbor, meaning visibility was seriously impaired. Between 1941 and 1944, the 429 sailors who perished on the USS Oklahoma were recovered and buried. Divers and salvage crews worked to right the ship, which had capsized during the attack. Air was pumped into the chambers of the vessel, forcing 20,000 tons of water out of the ship, allowing the remaining bodies to be recovered. Identification. One of the significant challenges following the attack was the identification of those men who had been successfully recovered. The brutal nature of the deaths many of those men faced meant they were often highly disfigured, burnt, or even torn to pieces. Facial identification was thus impossible for many, and genetic or DNA testing was yet to be developed. Of those 1,177 killed on the Arizona, only 105 were identified. The rest were either unidentifiable or their bodies were unable to be safely and respectfully recovered. Hundreds were hurriedly buried in unmarked graves, sometimes with multiple men in one casket. After one exhumation in 2003, one single casket was found to contain the DNA of 94 different men. In 1947, the American Graves Registration Service disinterred the remains of many casualties buried in Hawaii in an effort to identify them, transporting them to the Central Identification Laboratory. Despite their efforts, they only succeeded in naming 35 men. In the 8 decades following the attack, many more attempts have been made to identify the men who were buried as unknown soldiers. Advances in DNA and genetic testing mean known relatives of the deceased can be tested and linked to the DNA harvested from the otherwise unidentified remains. Hundreds of previously unknown soldiers and Marines have been identified in the years following the attack. Since 2015, the D3AD has worked diligently to identify the remains of the crew members of the USS Oklahoma, using DNA testing, dental records, and material evidence. As of September 2021, 396 of 429 crew members have been successfully identified. The 33 who could not be identified were re-interred at Punchbowl Cemetery, their original resting place. Bureaucratic red tape also played a part in the slow identification of men. One Navy fireman, Edwin Hopkins, was in the belly of the USS Oklahoma when it was struck, the first vessel to be hit during the attack. He was buried, along with many others, in an unknown grave. Despite this, veterans and family members working to identify the dead found that before being interred at the National Memorial Cemetery as an unknown, his body had been identified during the initial recovery. He would be exhumed in 2016 and reburied alongside his parents. Another victim of the Oklahoma, Herbert Jacobson, was identified in 2019. He would be buried at Arlington National Cemetery in 2022 after a military funeral. Those who survived the sinking of the Arizona have the right to be interred alongside their fallen comrades, and as of 2020, 40 crew members have had their ashes deposited in the turret barbette of the sunken ship. 80 years on, the deceased and their families are still not forgotten. There are many left to identify, but with modern technology, there is a chance for everyone to receive a proper burial in their own grave, and for their families to finally receive solace and closure. Artifacts of the fallen. Many personal effects, such as sailors' caps, binoculars, and officers' swords, have also been discovered, and the uniforms of some men are stored according to the men they belong to. Letters written and photographs taken by the serving men before the attack are also preserved and kept in a climate-controlled room to slow their degradation. The collection of letters grows by 5% every year, as the families of the fallen send them to the museum to be preserved and cared for. In total, 67,000 individual items have been salvaged and preserved, and now stand in the Pearl Harbor Memorial Museum. Arizona's silver tea sets and an Elgin military clock stand alongside the American flag, which flew from the mast on the morning of the attack. Memorial. The hulks of Arizona and Utah now serve as eternal memorials to the attack, with over 1 million people visiting every year. The Pacific War Memorial Commission was created in 1949 with a plan to erect a permanent memorial. The ongoing Korean War meant efforts to establish a monument were slow, but by 1955, the first permanent memorial had been erected, a stone plaque resting over the deckhouse of the USS Arizona. A 180-foot bridge now stands over the ship, allowing visitors to look down at the ghostly vessel. The tears of the Arizona, fuel and oil, still slowly leaking from the ship, can still be observed as the bulkheads continue to rot away 80 years on. The USS Missouri, an intact vessel on whose deck the Japanese surrendered formally to General Douglas MacArthur, is moored alongside the Arizona Memorial and serves as a museum ship intended to guard over the sailors who remain underwater. In reverence to the war dead, every Navy, Coast Guard, or merchant marine vessel that passes by the Arizona participates in the manning the rails. As their ship slowly sails into the port, the men on board stand to attention at the guardrails and give the Arizona a silent salute. The 7th of December 1941 will forever live on as a day of infamy, a surprise attack against a nation that was not yet at war. The events of that day are viscerally ingrained in the minds of Americans, even those born long after this terrible event. The attack proved to be a turning point in history, leading to American entry into the war, forever changing the course of time. Despite feeling like another age, people directly affected still live. Many of these relatives are still without the closure of a named grave for their loved ones. The United States Navy and various charitable groups still work daily to put names to the unknown bodies, and those unfortunate enough to remain in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor are watched over by the USS Missouri and the many faithful curators and caretakers of the Pearl Harbor Memorial Museum.